Right then, welcome back. I'm going to be talking about control and conformity. So we're going to be thinking about political structures within society, how they lead to control, conformity of the population. Quite light touch. It's a little bit of theory, but not much. And then offer you some examples of surveillance technologies that you might like to write about if you're thinking about these issues in your piece. And also some examples of dystopian fiction, of fiction that uses these kinds of measures. So, before we do that, I'm going to open with... come on, PowerPoint. There we go. The wellness geese are being introduced to help you all de-stress. I saw this on Twitter and thought it was absolutely hilarious. So, there you go, the wellness geese. Honk, honk. Back to the topic at hand. Okay, 3 key terms to give you an understanding of what these terms mean, and they are terms that you will have been using, but you may not necessarily know exactly where they came from or their provenance. A bit about surveillance technology, about dystopia and surveillance states, and then, of course, the so what. So, where is this in literature, and why do we care? The final slide is some questions about the text that I paired with this theme, which is Yevgeny Zamyatin's We. It's not very long. You might like to read it. It is a classic, so if you can read it, then I highly recommend that you do. I've also, in the notes on YouTube, I've included another story, which is The Machine Stops. Probably the first example of dystopian fiction in English, written by Forster. So it's only a short story. Again, give it a look. And another book that you might be interested in, which is non-fiction, recommended to me by my partner. So it's this one, Hello World by Hannah Fry. How to be Human in the Age of the Machine. And she writes about all kinds of different technologies and how they're changing the way that we interact with the world. It's really, really interesting stuff. Not necessarily related to dystopia, but it's a topic that you might find interesting. So, the first key term, totalitarianism. It's a word that anyone who did history in the UK school system will be familiar with, usually in relation to Nazi Germany. It's not fully interchangeable with the word dictatorship. But here is a definition. This is from Hannah Arendt, who's one of the most important thinkers in this kind of field. And she writes this. Totalitarianism, in power, uses the state administration for its long-range goal of world conquest. It establishes the secret police as the guardians of its domestic experiment in constantly transforming reality into fiction. And it finally erects concentration camps as special laboratories to carry through its experiment in total domination. Now Arendt is writing with a very specific background. She is German Jewish, so you can see where she's taking her ideas from. But the point remains, totalitarianism is about the total control of the government over the people and the total subordination of the people to the government. Definitely something that was seen in Germany in the 30s and 40s, and in Russia, China, and other parts of the world that have those kinds of political regimes. It's a term that gets thrown around quite a lot, especially in the modern era. We are thankfully not there yet, but it is a political system that we see coming up time and again in science fiction. Second term, utopia. So, utopia. Again, a word that you might know, but it has a fascinating etymology, and I hope you will forgive me my Greek here. We're going to have to think about what the word means. Most people would believe it to be a dream of order in a chaotic world, a utopian society, one where everything is perfect. But the word itself is confusing, and it depends on that first syllable. So either we have utopia, O-U, which would be nothing or never or not it's a negative participle, so not a place, or you, good or true. And that's the definition that most people know. Utopia as a good place, and then topia from topos, place. So either we have utopia, the not place, the non-existent place, or utopia, the good, the true place. And really it depends on how you want to use the word. Thomas More coined it in his 15 and 16 book, Utopia, and for him he's really going with the first one. It's a very satirical book, and a lot of the argument rests on the fact that there can be no utopia because everyone else's understanding of good is very different. Ooh. And here's a quotation from Vieira. So, by creating two neologisms, that is, new words, which are so close in their composition and meaning, a lexical neologism, utopia, and a derivation, utopia, More created a tension that has persisted over time and has been the basis for the perennial duality of meaning of utopia as the place that is simultaneously a non-place and a good place. So we're aware of this tension between the two words and the way that they do not necessarily exist pleasantly side by side. 1 second. Excuse me. Okay, next term, dystopia. Let me just move down here. So this is first used in 1869 by John Stuart Mill, very, very influential philosopher, and he used it in a parliamentary speech. So, to go back to Vieira, if utopia was commonly seen as too good to be practicable, dystopia was too bad to be practicable. And the word itself, dys, from the Greek dys, bad, abnormal or diseased, and again topos, place. So it's the bad, the worst, the absolute back end of hell kind of place. And little interesting fact for you, if you've read Dante's Inferno, the lower end of Inferno is called the city of Dys. So that word coming up again to suggest the absolute hell on earth. Quotation from Claeus. Utopia, often conceived as More's pun to be both a good place and nowhere, seems paradoxically to be equally potential, a very dismal place found practically everywhere, and less a sanctuary of holiness than an emptying out of the evils of Pandora's box, in which hope alone remained restrained. So, the idea of utopia as being this no place which is everywhere, and also this emptiness of feeling, this emptiness of anything, which leads it to being completely drained of feeling. Okay then, let me just move myself to here. So we're thinking about control and surveillance and the way that governments, the way that societies control its citizens and how this features through into science fiction writing. And when we've talked about these issues in class, we often think about different types of technologies that end up being used. Now, I don't want to alarm anyone or suggest paranoia. If you are feeling that this is a bit overwhelming, please do feel free to turn off. But here are some examples of technologies that we have in our daily lives. We might use them every day, but that are particularly problematic when thinking about ideas of control. So we'll go from the top left. A drone, a camera drone, surveying population, an unmanned flying thing that is taking video of usually an urban area. And they're quite commonly used for crowd control, that kind of thing. Which links to the picture underneath it, CCTV. Monitored or unmonitored, we in the UK are on camera hundreds of times a day because of the amount of CCTV that we have in this country. It's one of the most surveilled countries in the world. Facial recognition Now this is a fairly crappy image that I took off Google Images, but measuring the points of your face to see similarities between people. That's basically how facial recognition works. And it's now being used, it's now being implemented through CCTV, so you can track people. I'm not necessarily sure how this is going to work, considering most CCTV cameras are not high def enough to really even tell what a person looks like, let alone this. But you never know. Fingerprint scanning. This is an example of the ones, if anyone's ever had a visa, you've had to scan your fingerprints. Also, I think entering the US, you have to give your fingerprints. And it will be done on a machine like this. So they're stored electronically. A way of collecting biometric data to be stored, to be used for, I imagine that the US government would say for security purposes, whatever that means. And chip and pin. So being able to, we think, oh, it's just a way of taking money out of our bank accounts, but it's tracking the use of your card. And anyone who watches murder mystery documentaries or anything like that, the number of times they look at PIN transactions or card transactions to see where a card was used to track an individual geographically, as well as to see what you've been buying. And this is a reason that my partner uses cash all the time. He doesn't want the government to know what he's buying. And I used to think that was paranoid, but now I'm kind of starting to see it's a good thing. The picture in the bottom of this chap, I think he's Korean, although I can't remember, was posted because it's a passport photo and it shows one of the dangers of all this kinds of software. So the bit in red highlighted, the photo you want to upload does not meet our criteria because the subject's eyes are closed. The baseline of this technology, who is it being calibrated for, who is not being included. And there was another recent example of a woman in the UK who had a similar issue. She had uploaded a picture and it did not upload because it claimed her mouth was open, but actually she is a black woman and it was recognising the shape of her lips and thinking that meant her mouth was open. So that kind of software being used against specific body types, usually almost entirely white and male and Western, and then being unable to recognise others, which is in itself a problem. You end up with ridiculous situations like this guy's passport photo, but it also means that when it comes to using for surveillance technologies, who is going to be targeted and why? If technology cannot tell between two people from East Asia, where is that going to end up? What are the implicit issues in that? And that leads to these questions. So asking yourself about these kinds of data, where are the data stored? So if you're using, for example, Snapchat, if you're using a Snapchat filter, where is that picture being stored? Where is that image going? And what's it being used for? Who can access the data? Facebook have been accused of selling people's pictures. All kinds of different photo sharing apps have been using photos. A lot of the stuff for facial recognition is taking pictures off the internet to measure itself by, but also things like voice recordings, if you're posting voice recordings. Hell, maybe even this video. Where is that data being stored and who is accessing it? And why is it needed? One question, a conversation I had this morning with Carsten was about equal opportunities forms. Why does the government need to know his religion? Where is that data being kept? And why is it being kept? Why is it important that I'm Zoroastrian or bisexual or however I might tick on that form? What is the importance of that and why is it needed? Which leads to the question of how these data are working for or against me. Is it going to become an issue that I use my chip and pin card to buy vegan cheese? Is it something that's going to be used in order to control? For the most part, it's used to send me Tesco coupons, but that's still a form of surveillance technology. and it might be a very benign one, it might be a very capitalist one, which is not the same as benign, of course, but it is showing how we are being surveilled through these types of technology. The other big question, who is the baseline for data collection? So as we've seen with the passport photo problems, the Caucasian face has become the baseline for that kind of technology, which means that people who have different facial features that are more normal in other ethnic groups. Someone's decided to drill a hole in the wall. Those people are going to be unfairly targeted. And if those photos are then being used to recognise faces in large crowds, are they going to be picking up people, accusing people of crime, all kinds of things, based on faulty technology? The other thing to remember is, of course, the default person is male. So, for example, when we listen to recordings of women talking and feel like they sound just a little bit off, that's because the software is calibrated to a male voice. It's nothing to do with women's voices being off. It's to do with software calibration. And this is an issue that we're facing over and over. It can also be incredibly exclusionary to people who are disabled, who have, I don't know, all manner of different identities who are not being catered to because they're not being taken into consideration during data collection. And then, of course, the big, super duper paranoid question, what will happen if a totalitarian regime takes over? No one thought it was going to happen in the 30s, and then suddenly all of the religious data collected on the population of the Netherlands became incredibly useful. Where is this going to go? At the moment we think, oh gosh, yeah, the Tories don't care if I'm, whatever I am, vegetarian. But that might suddenly become an issue if another political regime takes over. There are all manner of ways that information can be mobilised for you or against you. And it's just being savvy to those questions, how these things are being used and where you sit in relation to these questions. So one of the big crossovers in sci-fi is this crossover between sci-fi and dystopia. Not all sci-fi is dystopian, not all dystopia is sci-fi. But largely through issues of technology, the two have become really quite intimately connected. So here's a quotation from Vieira. Two ideas, intimately concerned, have fed dystopian discourse. On the one hand, the idea of totalitarianism. On the other hand, the idea of scientific and technological progress, which, instead of impelling humanity to prosper, has sometimes been instrumental in the establishment of dictatorships. So, that scientific and technological progress, that thing which is driving a lot of sci-fi, with techno-sci-fi, is the instrument by which totalitarianism thrives and dictators are put in place. So there's a reason that so much of dystopian fiction is also really, really rather sci-fi. It's because the mechanisms by which these political regimes are able to flourish is through the technology itself. So if we think of something like 1984, which is not particularly technological, there are telescreens in all the rooms. Everything that you do is being watched. Thought crime is a crime because they have the technology to look at you at all times and to gauge emotion, gauge thought based on surveillance, quite literal surveillance technology. So it's all to do with that kind of use of technology and how it will then allow different types of political regime to flourish. And it's strange that we very rarely see technology being used in order to create positives in sci-fi. We are quite a doom and gloom kind of genre in that respect. It does seem to be, this is the absolute worst. And some may say it's quite Luddite. So the Luddites destroying technology, during the Industrial Revolution, saying it's taking labour away from men's hands. The neo-Luddites now saying that technology, far more advanced technology, is taking away from human labour and human interaction with the world. And I don't necessarily disagree in some cases. So here's some examples in literature of dystopian sci-fi and of technologically driven dystopian sci-fi. So, of course, the big one, Black Mirror, is all about how technology is going to be, is changing our world and not necessarily for the better. A Clockwork Orange, fantastic novel, written in this very odd language called Nadsat. And the technology in this is this very bizarre medical procedure which is supposed to brainwash people against violence. If you're interested in the story and that concept, I do recommend that you watch the film, although the film is incredibly violent and does include a rape scene, so there's a warning. The book is also excellent, but it can be very difficult to read. And it's thinking about controlling of the individual. So the government has this technology to control and to wipe out violence one man at a time, and it's looking at how that works or doesn't work, as the case may be. Margaret Atwood, The Handmaid's Tale, again, not heavy on the technology, but if we're looking back at the sort of the backstory of how they got there are the sections where it shows how the technology developed. It was things like cutting off women's bank accounts, cutting off women's access to such and such. So again, using that data that has been collected, using data stored against the individual to then control. And if anyone has read the Testaments, it goes into a bit more detail about how certain technologies were mobilized against the population. And finally, right in the middle, Judge Dredd. I'm not sure if there's any fans of 2000 AD out there. Very, very famous, long-running British comic. But Judge Dredd is set in Megacity 1. It's a dystopian future in which the world is crumbling and law and order has become this sort of this monolith that is being used to control the people, and the judges, of which Dredd is one of them, have this ultimate control. And how that plays out in this society is through violence and all kinds of levels of control against the population. So there's some examples. There are thousands upon thousands more, and I simply picked the ones that I particularly like, because I can, but also because you know the other examples. So I don't need to go into too much detail talking about all of them. Okay. Here are some questions. Where can I put myself? I'm out of the way. Damn it. Let's go over here and I'm going to cover up that. Okay. So these are questions asking about we. So why is this book written in first person? In what ways is it like other novels and how is it different? Happy endings, natural worlds, portrayal of the state, those kinds of things. Questions that you might like to think about. They're not essential, but they might help guide your reading. And they give you an idea of what kinds of things you might like to draw out if you yourself are writing this kind of stuff. Thinking about the narratorial voice. Is it important that we have a first-person narrator or a third-person narrator? And if you think about other examples of these kinds of fiction, what kinds of narrator do we have? So think about 1984, Handmaid's Tale. Where is the narrator? And how does it colour what we read? What kinds of things are similar across all of these books? Recently, someone had made a comment about how, with young adult fiction being so heavily dystopian, and the readers of these books being the next to vote, we're all screwed, which I thought was very funny. And also very true. How are these books, what are they keeping similar throughout the ages? And what is different? And how is this potentially going to lead on to influencing voting groups? how does the narrator reflect the world? So what kind of character are you drawing? How are you drawing this character? And to what extent is that important in their positioning in the world? And also, how are different places within the world that you've created represented, the natural and the state? Or potentially you might have a split between the in-group and the out-group. It's entirely up to you, but they're things that you might like to think about. And then, of course, the happy ending. In a dystopian society, what is a happy ending? Is it death? Is it escape? Is it everything going back to normal under the regime? Is it total downfall of the regime? What's the happy ending? And do you want to give your story one? And if you do, why? And if you don't, why not? There's no right or wrong answer to any of these questions, but they are things that will help you to think through that creation of a dystopian society and the sorts of things that you might like to be thinking about. It's kind of world building, sort of political world building. And the more that you know the world in which you're writing, the richer you will allow your story to be. So I hope this has helped. The next topic I'm going to put out is transhumanism, which is an absolute banger. So that should be coming quite soon. As ever, any questions, drop me a line. Any comments, do the same.